It's week 8 of the Bible Challenge. We're continuing in Numbers, continuing in Psalms, finishing up the Gospel of Mark, and starting into the Gospel of Luke. Last week we talked in an introductory fashion about Numbers. Last week we covered Numbers chapters 1 to 3, but just for purposes of review, let's go back and think about where the name comes from. Numbers. This is the name that derives from the fact that there is a census that takes place in Israel. The tribes are numbered. The problem with the name is that it ignores the fact that there's a lot of narrative, a lot of history, a lot of poetry, a lot of things going on in Numbers, and it makes it sound literally numerical and cut and dried. The name for the book of Numbers in Hebrew is Bemidbar, which means in the wilderness, and that is a much more accurate description of what's going on. We are starting this week in chapter 4 in Numbers, and to review, the first 10 chapters of Numbers are focused on the census and the organization of the Israelites before their departure from Sinai. So everybody's getting together to determine how they're going to move together as a people. One aspect of the organization that we should note here is the distinctive role of the Levites as described in our readings last week in chapter 1, the order of march, and then how the Lord is very physically present. The tabernacle is present in the midst of the camp. That's an important point for the priestly writer, that the tabernacle is present, that the Lord is very present with the people physically. Now here we are, and we are moving forward in chapters 4, 5. We'll actually go all the way through chapter 20 this week in Numbers. And we start out with a conclusion of the census of the tribes of Israel in chapter 4, proceed through the preparations for the pilgrimage, which focus a lot on sort of what I'd call cultic purity, how we do things together to make sure that we are clean and worthy, both of the individual tribes and of the camp and of the community. That's the bulk of chapters 5 to 10. All these organizational details that say that we are pure and that we are ready to march forth together. And then we go straight into the narrative that talks about the wandering in the wilderness of Sinai. We're going to spend chapters 10 through 20 either wandering in the wilderness of Sinai, or as that wandering continues, going to the plains of Moab. So this is before the Israelites enter the promised land. They are not yet in the promised land. As I said, chapter 4, we have the census of the Levites, a description of their duties, and an important function of the Levites is to protect the people from dangerous exposure to God's holiness. Now, remember, the Lord is very much other here. He is not part of the people, although he is in their midst. They are dear to him, and he is to be dear to them. He is still depicted in things like a column of smoke, a column of flame, the way the pilgrimage has started with the crossing of the Red Sea. The Lord is now physically present in the tabernacle, and there are ways where you're not supposed to get too close, or you might be consumed. This is why the people are so worried later on in Deuteronomy, when Moses comes down from meeting God, and his face is literally glowing because he's been exposed to such holiness. They're worried about keeping him a little bit at the distance. And we get an example of this in chapter 10, where we have the story of Hobab and the ark. Hobab is walking along, people are carrying along the ark, and it looks like the ark is going to tip to the side and fall off the road. Hobab is not supposed to touch the ark. He's not one of the Levites, but with the best possible intention, he sits there and thinks, oh, I've got to help out. And he tries to grab the pole of the ark to make sure it doesn't fall down, and he is stricken. Why? Because he thinks that God can't take care of himself, is the message we get from that story. That we don't have to take care of God. God can and will take care of himself. The priests and the Levites are described here as bearing the iniquity. They bear the iniquity in protecting the people from God. So there is an idea that will continue through the history of the Christian church that clergy, ordained clergy, in some sense are part of the sacrificial offering. In a Christian sense, are participating in Jesus' sacrifice, in Jesus' atonement. We are all called to do that as followers of Christ. A lot of the theology of the Christian priesthood says there's a price to be paid for being ordained. It's not supposed to be sweetness and light. We are supposed to bear some of that iniquity as well. Any experienced member of the ordained clergy would probably be nodding his or her head at this point to agree with some of that theology. Why are the Levites able to do this? Why are they able to bear this iniquity? Well, for the same reason, theoretically, that ordained clergy are in the church, because God has set the Levites aside to do this. He has called them, He has identified the Levites as His servants, and therefore has equipped them to serve. This is an example that will go throughout all of the Bible and the history of the church, that no one will be called to any ministry beyond that ministry which God will equip him or her for. So if we are faithful and truly discern how we're being called to serve the world and God in His church, then God will equip us with whatever spiritual gifts we need to do that. It's not up to us. Chapter 6, we get the description of the vows of Nazarites. And these are a caste of people set aside for specific dedication to God. Now, the most famous Nazarite we're going to encounter in the book of the Judges, and that's Samson. We get the whole story about how Samson, when his hair is cut, he loses his powers. At least when I was a kid, I thought that there was some power in his hair, and Delilah cut his hair off, and therefore he lost his power. What actually we're learning in the story of Samson later on in Judges is that he was a strong man and able to do all the things he did because the Lord was with him, because of his consecration to God as a Nazarite. Once his hair was cut, that consecration was violated. He had in effect violated his consecration vows to God. The Lord was no longer with him. That way the Philistines were able to prevail over him. But we get a description of the Nazarites here. And the vows include some specific regulations about ritual purity. Not cutting hair, not consuming alcohol, things of that sort. We get echoes of this throughout the history of Israel and the history of the church, where we get groups of people worrying about how they are supposed to be pure in specific ways. That can go off the rails very quickly, and that's why things like monastic dedication are regulated under specific rules, such as the rule of St. Benedict, so that that noble intent doesn't get abused in practice. Now, as I said, God is very physically present in this narrative. The Israelites are accompanied in the wilderness by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The Lord is present for His people. Despite God's physical presence, and despite His provision of water in chapter 20 at Meribah, the people continue to murmur against God and against Moses. Now, what do we mean by murmuring? Well, it's the same thing that we mean now when people are murmuring. They're talking among themselves. They're complaining. They're saying, can we trust this Moses fellow? Is God leading us in a way here, or do we need to go back to Egypt? And we have a number of examples of murmuring going on. Each time the people express some decrease in their faith, some diminution of their faith, God provides, whether it's water, whether it's manna, whether it's quails, and yet the people continue to murmur. They're never satisfied. They're never casting their full reliance on God. They're in effect saying, well, we need some more proof, and we need some more stuff. Throughout the narrative, the people rebel against Moses, and even, as in chapters 13 and 14, against God, proposing to reject the promised land and return to the land of Egypt. This is where we get the famous words like, "Why did you bring us out here into the wilderness to die? When we were in Egypt, we had cucumbers and garlic, and we ate our fill." And at this point in chapter 14, for example, Moses and Aaron need to intercede with God to quiet his wrath, because the people are expressing a lack of trust in God, and the Lord is wrathful as a result. Matters come to a head in a full-fledged revolt described in chapter 16. Now, at Numbers 13:33, we get another reference to these mysterious beings called Nephilim. They're the ones that showed up in chapter 6 of Genesis, where it said that they mated with the daughters of men. And we get some kind of idea that these are perhaps creatures other than human beings. The account in Genesis is referring to them as sons of God mating with human women before the flood. The root of Nephilim, the Nephil root, means fallen ones in Hebrew. And so the concept really is of fallen angels. Think of these as, when we get to Revelation at the end of the Bible, it talks about a war in heaven and Satan and his angels battling against the archangel Michael and his angels being cast out of heaven and falling to the earth. The Nephilim here are thought of as fallen creatures in some sense. There is a tradition in various interpretations of Numbers of them being giants. This is probably a corruption of the language. However, if you look at a recent film interpretation of this, not in a Numbers sense, but in a Genesis sense, if you look at Ridley Scott's recent film of Noah and the Ark, you have these mysterious large creatures show up. We need to be careful about that film, because the film actually does not follow the biblical account. The film follows a Gnostic account, and it's trying to pass off a bunch of Gnostic theology as biblical theology. The Nephilim, what can we say about them? Well, from a linguistic point of view, we can talk about them as giants, but this is probably an example of a later biblical writer being literal with a record of an earlier writer who wasn't being literal, and we get an unintended result. Numbers is clearly written after Genesis, quite a bit after Genesis, and so this mysterious reference in Genesis 6 to Nephilim, when we get to Numbers 13, it can get a little confusing there. We don't necessarily have to think of giants, but we can think of some kind of mysterious beings, probably fallen angels, who are in the promised land. In other words, they're going to resist what God intends here in God's plan, but we know who will prevail. Now, in the Psalms this week, we start out in Psalm 41, which is a wisdom psalm, and it begins with a teaching section, a didactic section, followed by a lament of one who is sick and abandoned, and ending, as a lament is supposed to after we bemoan the fact that we've been forgotten, with a final expression of confidence in God's saving power. The reference to the deadly thing which is fastened upon the psalmist in verse 8 is made using language found elsewhere in the Bible to refer to a malignant disease. And so some kind of malignancy, whether we're actually talking about cancer or whether we're talking about an infection, is not at all clear. But something external to the psalmist has attacked him and is wearing him down, and he is turning to God for cure. Psalm 42, this and Psalm 43 were originally probably one psalm, a long lament, and this can be seen in the refrain found in 42:6, 12, and 43:5, and in other parallels, that we're talking here about turning to God to meet all our needs. The opening line of the psalm has been famously set to music several times, notably by Palestrina, and in the 20th century by Herbert Howells. The musical settings we normally hear in English would use the translation from the King James or Authorized Version of the Bible, and so it would begin, like as the heart desireth the watered brook. You can find that on YouTube. Look for Herbert Howells, Like as the Heart. It's a wonderful musical piece. The Palestrina you can probably find under Like as the Heart as well, but you might have to look it up in Latin. Now, in 43, we also see that light and truth are personified as attendants in the courts of the Lord. We can take this in a metaphorical sense. In Psalm 44, we get a long communal lament, which begins with a confession of faith, and we get a similar sequence of confession followed by lament. We get that also in Psalm 89. One of the verses in Psalm 44 says, "Indeed, for your sake, we are being killed all the day long." Depends on which translation you're looking at. In the prayer book translation, it's verse 20. This is an inscription one can find in Yiddish at Auschwitz. And so offering a lament in that circumstance would surprise no one. Psalm 45 is a royal wedding hymn, considered to be very ancient, has a number of obscurities in it. The first line, at least in the King James translation, is famous from the coronation anthem written by Georg Friedrich Händel for the coronation of George I, the first of the Hanover monarchs in Britain. "My heart is inditing" is the King James translation, very famous coronation anthem you can also find on YouTube. The reference to an eternal throne in verse 7 in connection with the king may reflect the ancient Near Eastern tradition of royal divinity. In this respect, however, the language reflects, if it does have that, a non-Jewish importation into Judaism, because clearly the king in Judaism is not divine, the Lord is. Finally, in Psalm 46 this week, it's a musical week in Psalms. This is the first of the hymns extolling Zion, and this psalm is the one paraphrased by Martin Luther in his famous chorale, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." As in most ancient Near Eastern thinking, the psalm contrasts chaos with divine order, the peaceful city being divine order. We finish up Mark's Gospel this week, starting in chapter 15 this week, and this contains a very compressed account of Jesus' trial before the high priest and then before Pilate, of his crucifixion and his death. Mark is much less detailed than the other evangelists. Recall, we've spoken about this before, in Mark's Gospel it is the outsiders who recognize who Jesus is. His own inner circle, his own disciples seem to be pretty clueless throughout. They don't quite get it. Here in the actual crucifixion, it is the centurion who is commanding the execution party who confesses who Jesus is at chapter 15, verse 39, when he says, "Truly this man was the Son of God." In church tradition from a very early time, for example, written in the Church Father Papias, the centurion is given a name, Longinus, Longinus. That's not in the Bible. There is an early church tradition about Longinus going on and becoming a bishop in the church in Asia Minor. Jesus, in the Passion account, Jesus is executed under Roman law. That's why he's crucified. This is the Roman form of execution for the most extreme form of criminal or slave. So what essentially is the charge against him? It's that he's claimed to be king. That is, he's claimed to have challenged the emperor in the eyes of the law. Mark presents the temple authorities as the prime movers behind Jesus' condemnation, but the Romans are the actual agents of his death. It's possible that the account may reflect an early Christian apologetic approach that sought to de-emphasize Roman responsibility and shift blame to the temple authorities. Because the early Christians were trying to curry favor with Rome. This becomes pretty prominent in Luke's Gospel, for example. Mark was written about the time of the first organized persecution of Christians in Rome under the Emperor Nero. That persecution was around 66 AD, and Mark was written probably between AD 64-67, sometime in the same time frame. Pontius Pilate, we know, was Roman prefect in Judea from AD 26 to 36. So the external historical facts square well with the Gospel account. Pontius Pilate was described in sources external to the Gospel accounts as notably cruel, which he certainly doesn't come across as in Luke or in John. So again, there may be a little bit of apologetic going on there. He comes across as indifferent and corrupt, but not willfully cruel. If we read other ancient historians such as Eusebius, he comes across as notably cruel and known in the Roman Empire for that. And you have to do a lot to get that reputation in the Roman Empire. Pilate would not normally have been in Jerusalem. His headquarters were in Caesarea Maritima. This is near modern Haifa. He came to Jerusalem to supervise the policing of the Passover pilgrimage. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem would have been in what was called the Fortress Antonina, probably having somewhere between 400 and 800 troops there. Later on in the account from Acts, when the Roman prefect sends Paul under escort to the governor's palace for trial in Caesarea, he sends several centuries of soldiers and an ala of cavalry. Clearly the Romans are expecting trouble, because if we were to translate that into modern parlance, what kind of force is being deployed to protect this prisoner on escort? It's the equivalent of a battalion of armored cavalry or armored infantry. It's a big military force. They're expecting trouble. They're expecting some kind of rebellion when Paul is taken from Jerusalem in Acts. Getting back to Mark here, however, the Gospel accounts, as I say, are more sympathetic to Pilate than our contemporary Roman accounts, which portray him as notably cruel. There is no extra biblical account of this supposed tradition of the Romans releasing one prisoner at the Passover. We just don't have any other record outside the Gospels of that. So when we see Barabbas being released, he's exactly the kind of prisoner the Romans would not have wanted to release. And his name is particularly obscure here because it literally means the son of the father. So Bar, son of, Abbas, father in the Aramaic dialect, the son of the father. Why would we call somebody that? He might just be kind of a prototypical character. There is evidence there was a real person, but we may not even know his real name. Now Jesus is scourged, and this involved being whipped with a many-tailed whip, kind of like a cat o' nine tails, but with short tails on it. And it would have bits of bone or glass or metal in the leather tips. Scourging is designed to remove skin and cause significant blood loss. It's designed to weaken the condemned so that he will die quickly on the cross. By the time a scourging is completed, the prisoner is going to be pretty close to shock. Wine is mingled with myrrh due to the narcotic effect of myrrh. It's supposed to cause the induction of sleep and some diminution in pain. Jesus refuses it. Mark's account ends very quickly. The entire Gospel of Mark was probably intended to be read aloud at one sitting. Remember, there are no church buildings when this is read. This is something that happens in somebody's house. You can read the whole thing in a little over 2 hours. And therefore the text tradition early in the church is that Mark actually ends at verse 8. This is right after the women have found the tomb empty, and it says that they leave in fear and trembling. Verses 9 to 20 are probably a later addition where we talk about post-resurrection appearances. If we end it at 8, it's kind of like an old campfire story where the action gets pitched into your lap, because it actually ends on the Greek word for 4. So fear and trembling came upon them, 4, boom, it's in your lap. Now the action shifts to you as the listener. The word in Greek is gar, and it can mean for or because. The storyteller now pitches the action to the audience. Luke is a very different gospel. We start in Luke this week, and we're going to be through the first 4 chapters of Luke here. Luke's gospel likely dates from the 9th decade. It reflects a knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70, but not of the persecution of Christians from later years of the rule of Domitian, the emperor who ruled from 81 to 96. And none of the disputes between the Christians and the synagogue following the Council of Jamnia in the year 85, when the Christians get kicked out of the synagogues. Between 85 and 90, then there are all these reforms that the Pharisees engage in, and we get what's called rabbinical Judaism, because there is no temple anymore. So Luke's probably somewhere right in that 9th decade, right around the year 85 would be a pretty good guess. Luke is identified from the New Testament sources as a Greek-speaking physician, probably a Syrian from Antioch. And recall, Antioch is where we're going to learn in Acts the believers, the followers of Jesus, were first called Christians. Luke's Greek is much more sophisticated than that of the other gospel writers. Most of the Greek in the Gospels is very basic Greek. Luke's is more academic Greek. He likely wrote his gospel in Achaia, which is part of Greece, or he may have written it in Rome. And he actually wrote one big long work, with Luke being volume 1 and Acts being volume 2. In volume 2 in Acts, he talks about traveling around with Paul. He'll say, and then we came to this place. That's why some people thought he wrote it in Rome, because Paul, of course, eventually ends up in Rome following shipwreck and various other things. Luke tells us up front that he was not present for Jesus' earthly ministry, that he researched sources, that he was not an eyewitness. He says this in chapter 1 of his Gospel and in chapter 1 of Acts. Now, Luke clearly relies on Mark as one source. And he also shares another source with Matthew. This second source is commonly referred to by scholars as Q. It's from the German word for source, which is Quelle. And it's probably an oral tradition in the community of believers. Luke also seems to have his own unique extra source. Church tradition early on says this is the Virgin Mary. If you note the extra details in Luke's Gospel about Jesus' birth and all the stories attendant on his birth are told from Mary's perspective. Matthew's Gospel, they're told more from the perspective of Joseph, and the church early on said that that Matthew's extra source was probably James, Jesus' brother, Joseph's oldest son. It kind of fits together. Do we have documentary proof of that? No. But if we're looking at early Christian traditions, this is eyewitness testimony being passed on by people. Luke is addressed predominantly to a Gentile audience, to non-Jews, but he emphasizes a continuity between the church and the Jewish law. Luke's depiction of Jesus emphasizes Christian belief as a fulfillment of the law, but he doesn't uphold any of the strict entry requirements into the church. He has a way of saying that Jesus has taken care of a lot of these sort of kosher boundaries, for example. Luke has a special regard for the poor and for women. These outcasts, so to speak, play a significant role in the reconstituted Israel depicted by Luke. They're prominent characters throughout Luke who are either women or who are poor or both, and they get to talk a lot, so Luke pays a lot more attention to them. Jesus in Luke is depicted as a prophet of God's justice and mercy, and in the fully divine Jesus, God's justice and mercy are united and literally incarnated. Unlike in Mark, the people, Jesus' disciples for example, are not depicted as blind and stubborn and clueless. They are able to form a bond of community. Now this may be because Luke's writing a lot later, and he's talking to people who have gotten it more since about 20 years earlier when Mark was writing his gospel based on Peter's recollections. Luke's infancy narrative of Jesus is set as a depiction of God's fulfillment of his promise of election and salvation. And so we get an emphasis on the fulfillment of prophecy, as found in the stories of Zechariah the priest and Simeon the prophet in the temple. John the Baptist's preaching is a fulfillment of prophecy, with the prophecy then being truly fulfilled in Jesus. And that's going to set the stage for us going forward in Luke into Jesus' public ministry. That's where we'll start next week. Thank you for being with us again this week, and keep plugging away at the Bible Challenge.